Well, with that in mind, we are not going to waste any more time. We are going to bring our speaker up, Dr. Kara Powell, and she is Chief of Leadership Formation, Executive Director of the Fuller Youth Institute, Professor of Youth and Family Ministry. And, Kara has been a great friend of Legacy for a long time. So her mission that I took right off her website is I believe in young people. I believe in the church. My aim is to see teens and young adults be changed by Christ to change the world around them. That is her goal and her mission, and that is our goal and mission too. So, Kara, come on up. Such a pleasure to have you here. We are really looking forward. So, Kara, it's all yours. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Barb. It's an honor to be here with you all for these important discussions that we want to have. Honest, practical, insightful, transformative discussions that we want to have as grandparents. And I should clarify, I am not a grandparent yet. I don't imagine I will be anytime soon. My husband and I have 3 kids, 2 who are college students, and then we have a 16-year-old who's in 11th grade. But I'm such a fan of you as grandparents. There's some fascinating research showing that grandparents' influence is not decreasing, it's increasing. And thanks to things like technology, you have ways to love and minister to your grandparents or your grandkids, even if they don't live near you, that previous generations of grandparents didn't have. And there's one particular grandparent I'm very grateful for who's watching tonight. This is my mom. Hey, Mom. And she's watching tonight. And this was a picture of her at one of our kids' schools' Grandparents' Day. And she's just been an incredible grandparent who has invested so much in our kids through prayer, through making all sorts of breakfasts, through showing up at events, through supporting them and caring about them tangibly. And so, Mom, I'm grateful for you, and I am grateful for all of you as grandparents. And my hope and prayer tonight is that this time together will increase your legacy. I love that that's the first word of the Legacy Coalition. Legacy, legacy, legacy. I know that you want to implant in your kids and grandkids a deep faith that lasts. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, and particularly how you as a grandparent can really be in the strike zone of your grandkids' biggest questions. So let's start by talking about this generation. I love young people, as Barb said so well, and I want to give you 3 adjectives that describe this generation of young people, those born after 2000. So your grandkids, your family members, what are they like? And so our team at the Fuller Youth Institute, we look through all sorts of research, both academic and popular, and we've landed on 3 adjectives that we think describe this generation of young people. First off, this generation is an anxious generation. And I wish I could start out with a more positive word, but friends, this is just the reality of this generation of young people. According to the Center for Disease and Control, during the pandemic, anxiety has tripled, depression has quadrupled. I will say this, I don't know a family with teenage daughters or granddaughters who isn't dealing with mental health challenges. There's some research that indicates that teenage girls are about twice as likely to deal with mental health challenges, anxiety, stress, depression, even suicidal ideation and tendencies. And we're seeing that. It's so rampant in our young girls, and also an issue with our young boys. So I want you as grandparents to be mindful of that. First off, that this is an anxious generation. Secondly, here's a more positive word. This is an adaptive generation. This generation is so creative, entrepreneurial, visionary. They really do want to change our world. And they have so many creative ways that they're doing that. And then lastly, this generation is the most diverse generation that we've ever seen in our country. According to census data, we crossed a line in 2020. In the midst of everything else that happened in 2020, we crossed a line, and now half of those under 18 are young people of color, and half are young people who are white. So this generation, they're anxious, they're adaptive, they're diverse. And as I think about who you are as grandparents, what if we could be the most empathetic families that any young person has ever seen? What if we could so understand what young people were wondering, that our conversations and the things we did with them were so meaningful to them and to us? I want to help you better connect and converse with this generation. And unfortunately, a lot of times we miss this generation's most pressing questions. I was heartbroken when a 15-year-old said this: "I wish the church would stop giving me answers to questions I'm not asking. I wish the church would stop giving me answers to questions I'm not asking." And while he said this about the church, I think this could be true of some of our families too. And we want to help you avoid that problem. We want to help you be right in the strike zone of what your grandkids, your step grandkids are wondering. So, as a research team at the Full Youth Institute, we thought, what if we could identify the big questions boiling beneath young people's daily questions? And I'm in particular talking about teenagers' questions. I know many of you don't have teenage grandchildren yet. You will, and you're so wise. You're so wise to be thinking ahead about what it's going to be like when your elementary age or preschool grandkids become teenagers. So what if we could identify the 3 questions that boil beneath young people's questions about social media, about what they're going to do on Friday night, about where they're going to go to college, or are they going to the military, the workforce, whatever it might be. And so we were able to mobilize a very diverse research team to identify 3 big questions that pulse beneath everything else that young people are asking. The first question is identity. Who am I? Who am I? The second question is belonging. Where do I fit? This is something young people are so wondering. Belonging, where do I fit? And the third question is purpose. What difference can I make? Identity, belonging, purpose. These are the 3 big questions that young people are asking. Now, I need to be clear. It's not just teenagers or young adults who are asking these questions. All of us are asking these questions. And in fact, in times of transition, these questions are more intense. So for those of you who are maybe early in a season of retirement, that's a big transition. These questions can pop up for us. And young people are in a time of ongoing, almost permanent transition. So what I like to say is, for many of us as adults, these questions are at a low simmer. But for young people, these questions are at a rolling boil. What's fascinating about living in Los Angeles is it's so interesting to talk to people in the entertainment industry who say that these questions actually separate good scripts from mediocre scripts, good shows from less exciting, less compelling shows. And so just thinking about some of what's been popular in the last year or so. This Is Us, a show that your grandkids aren't watching probably, but some of you or your kids are watching. It's all about identity, belonging, and purpose. The Marvel Universe. Oh my goodness, those characters are wrestling with identity, belonging, and purpose. For some of our older grandkids, The Office. It's so amusing how teenagers and young adults love The Office, even when they've never worked in an office setting. But it's all about identity, belonging, and purpose. And so that's where a diverse team of Fuller students, as well as scholars from other institutions, we did a deep dive research. We did over 100 hours of interviews with 27 very diverse teenagers from all across the country, spending 4 to 6 hours with each teenager. 13 different ethnic backgrounds were represented. And then we paired that deep analysis with a wide analysis of over 2,000 teenagers through interviews and surveys and focus groups. And that's how we landed on these three big questions. Here, I want you to get a sense for the diversity of the young people that were represented in our sample. All sorts of different diversity was part of the sample. And as Barb has already said, you can do a deeper analysis of these three questions in our new book, Three Big Questions That Change Every Teenager. So part of what we did in our research is once we identified identity, belonging, and purpose, we thought, okay, how are young people currently answering these questions? What are they doing to currently give themselves answers to these questions? And so I want to tell you the top two answers that we heard from young people that they're currently using. The first, when it comes to identity, how are young people defining themselves? They're defining themselves largely by what others expect. Young people, they are like radars picking up the messages that family, including grandparents, are sending, that school, that church, that neighbors, that friends, that fellow basketball teammates are all sending. And so this becomes a little confusing for young people because these different groups often have different expectations for who they should be, which is closely related to the second current answer that young people tend to give. And we heard this so much especially in our interviews with young people. They don't feel blank enough. And different adjectives fill in that blank. They don't feel smart enough. They don't feel pretty enough. They don't feel popular enough. They don't feel talented enough. All of this makes them feel insecure, like there's this bar and they just can't measure up to it. So that's how they're currently answering this question of who am I? When it comes to belonging, how are young people currently developing a sense of belonging? When do they feel like they fit? They fit when they feel safe. And that word was used over and over and over again. When I feel safe to be myself. Sometimes that was with family, sometimes church, sometimes friends, but they want to feel safe with you and with others. And then secondly, what was fascinating is they often feel a sense of belonging if they share the same experience or same preference with others. This is good news for us as we think about our family sharing the same experiences together. This can help create a sense of belonging. For young people also, it's if they share the same AP calculus class, if they're on the same soccer team, if they're part of the same small group at church, if they share the same music preferences. Those are all things that give young people a sense of belonging. And then lastly, a sense of purpose. When they feel like they're making a difference. When does that tend to happen now? Well, here's good news for young people. It's often when they're helping others. The students that we interviewed were all kids nominated by their youth pastors, so probably had a predisposition to serve, but they wanted to be involved in service. And then secondly, they get their sense of purpose if they follow the script. Again, this is about external expectations, and they're paying close attention. What do you expect of them? What do teachers expect of them? What do friends expect of them? And this all comes together to create this sense of purpose for them. And sometimes that ends up creating actually a sense of pressure for young people. Here's what one young person said. I have a career in my mind that I want to do, but I don't know that that's what God wants for me. What if I pursue it and it ends up not being God's best for me? I will have spent 4 years studying something only to scrap it and start all over. I've always been told that our purpose as humans is to advance God's kingdom, and I want to do that, but I'm stressed because I don't know how I'm supposed to do that. We're well-intentioned, but sometimes we end up putting pressure on our grandkids. And sometimes our language can even do this. And it's been pointed out to me by speaker Louis Giglio. He talks about how, we want to be in God's will. And then we add this whole other layer that we'll say to our grandkids. It's not just about being in God's will. It's about being in the center of God's will. Like somehow being in the center of God's will is a little bit better than being a couple degrees off center. I think any part of God's will is really rich. So it's a good reminder for us to think about our language. Now, for the second half of what I want us to talk about, this is when we get to the how section, the application section. How can these questions make a difference in our relationships with our grandkids? Hopefully by now you have identity, belonging, and purpose written down somewhere. You're reflecting on it. That's the substance of the content, but now let's get to the substance of the application. What difference can this make? Well, here's the good news. Here's the God-sized news. Here's the gospel news, is that Jesus offers the best answers to these questions for all of us and for all of our grandkids. Jesus offers the best answers to these questions. In fact, part of how we think about discipleship these days at Fuller is discipleship is moving from our current answers to more Christ-centered answers. And again, this is a lifelong process. We're moving from our current answers to more Christ-centered answers. So what are those Jesus-centered answers? Well, this is where I love being at Fuller because we have so many amazing theology faculty, mission faculty, and psychology faculty. And as we pored over what Scripture had to say and what we see in today's young people, we've landed on one phrase for each of the big questions that we think is an important Jesus-centered answer. Now, with your grandkids, you might tweak it. You might have something else that's even more meaningful to them. But we offer this as a springboard that you can advance in your own family. Here's what I want your grandkids to know when it comes to identity: that they are enough because of Jesus. That Jesus makes them more than enough. In fact, one of my own daughters was struggling with something this weekend, and that's what I texted her when she left the house. I wanted her to know that I was thinking about her, I was praying for her, and so I said, "Hey, babe, Jesus makes you more than enough," and then added a prayer emoji hands. Jesus makes our grandkids enough and more than enough. That's what I want your grandkids to know. When it comes to belonging, as young people are looking for a sense of belonging in all different places, I want them to know that the best sense of belonging is they belong with God's people. That there's something about the unconditional love of the church that transcends the conditional love that they experience elsewhere. They belong with God's people. And then when it comes to purpose, I want your grandkids to know that they're invited into God's greater story. In fact, I had the chance to speak at one of my kids' baccalaureates when they graduated from high school. And so I told the whole graduating class that it's like God has a book, and there are pages in the book, and each page is a person. You are a page in God's book. And as a young person, you've written maybe a paragraph, but you have the whole rest of your page to write. And as adults, we get to journey with kids as they're experiencing what it means to be part of God's story. So identity, enough, belonging with, and purpose, they're part of God's story. Now, what's interesting is as we've tested these answers with people and these very questions, that each of us and every young person has a question that leads the way, has a question where maybe it's their default, or maybe it's their struggle, or maybe it's how God tends to work. My husband is totally a purpose person. When he hears about a problem in the world, he wants to grab his hammer, book a plane flight, and go there. He wants to solve the problem. He wants to be that person of purpose. One of our kids, she's all about belonging. She's all about belonging, and friends are her lifeblood. For me, my big question that I wrestle with is identity. And I often struggle with feeling like I'm not enough. And what's interesting is that doesn't happen at work. That doesn't happen to me as a leader, but it happens to me as a mom. And I compare the worst of what I know about myself to the best of what I see in other parents. And so I actually have a handful of prayers that I pray for myself. And one of them is that I would know that Jesus makes me enough. In fact, these answers of being enough, being with God's people, and being part of God's greater story, they've actually become the skeleton I use to pray for my own kids. Just this morning, I was on a prayer walk in our neighborhood, and for each of our 3 kids, I prayed these phrases. Jesus makes them enough, and what it means for them to live into that. They belong with God's people. How do they find that rich fellowship? And then when it comes to their future, how do they lean into being part of God's story and using their gifts to unpack that? And so I just want to invite you, as you think about the grandkids in your life, in your family, what message would you really want to impart to them about their identity, about their belonging, about their purpose? As you look at each individual grandkid, is one of those questions more salient, more pressing, more alive in them? And how do you help them really experience Jesus's best answer? Well, we're going to get to that in a moment, but first I just want you to think about individual young people and what are the best answers for them, for their identity, belonging, and purpose questions. Once we've done that, we can have better relationships. We can have better relationships. Part of our research we've done is we've studied amazing churches and churches that are growing young, that aren't shrinking or aging, but are doing great things with young people. And I know some of you are from Philadelphia. One of the churches that we visited was from Pennsylvania, actually. Not just Philadelphia, but Pennsylvania. And before we visited this church that was doing great work with young people, we always did interviews. We interviewed young people. We interviewed pastors ahead of time. And when we interviewed this church in Pennsylvania, the teenagers and the young adults, when we asked them, what do you love about their church? They all talked about Bill. They all loved Bill. And we thought, wow, Bill sounds amazing, because what Bill would do, especially for teenagers, is he would show up at their basketball games. He would show up at their plays. He would sit in the stands and cheer for those teenagers. And for college students and young adults, he would show up at their workplaces. He would take them out for coffee. He gave them that sense of belonging. And as he talked with them about identity and purpose. And this was just who Bill was. And so we thought, wow, we can't wait to meet Bill. And so the research team gets to this church in Pennsylvania. It turns out that Bill is over 70 years old. And Bill remembers in adolescence when there were no adults cheering him on in the stands. And so he has vowed that he is going to make sure that the kids, the young people in his church, there's always somebody cheering them on in the stands. There's always somebody who's giving them that sense of belonging. And so not only does he show up for kids' events, he recruits others to show up for kids' events. And he told us about this. He said, I have this one-page description and I love giving it to people, especially other senior adults. And we said, wow, Bill, that sounds amazing. Can you send us that sheet of paper? We'd love to see it. And so sure enough, Bill faxed it to us from the local public library, because that's how he was sending documents. And Bill is someone who's figured out how to tap into young people's identity, belonging, and purpose questions, and especially given them that sense of belonging. And part of what I love about Bill is he exemplifies this quality we've seen in our research, is that when it comes to young people, warm is the new cool. Warm is the new cool. Now, some of you on this, you're cool, and that's awesome. Like, you just keep being your cool grandparent selves. But for the rest of us who aren't that cool, the good news is we can remember Bill, and we can be ourselves, and we can have warm relationships, especially that create that sense of belonging that young people are hungry for. And by the way, my teenage and young adult kids say just the way that I say cool betrays that I am not cool. So somewhere they're getting the shudders because I'm saying the word cool and they say the way I say the word cool isn't cool. But anyway, and what's so fascinating is you in your life stage, you have an amazing gift of, again, giving young people a sense of better answers to all these questions, but especially when it comes to belonging. So I was in Iowa. I know some of you are in Iowa. It's a beautiful state. I was in Iowa a handful of years ago, and I was speaking about how we can build relationships with young people. And a woman came up to me, and she was probably in her early 80s. And she said, well, here's what I do. Every fall at my church, I ask my church for a list of everybody who's graduating from high school. And I send them all letters that fall. And I tell them they don't have to write me back, but I just want them to know that I'm thinking about them and praying for them. And she said, when I see these young people, they come home at Thanksgiving, they come home at Christmas, they thank me for writing these letters. And I thought, how wonderful that this woman, Ruth, is writing each youth group graduate one letter at the start of the fall as they're in college, the military, the workforce. I was so impressed with Ruth that the next day I was speaking in the same town in Iowa, and I thought, I'm going to share this story about Ruth. So I shared the story about Ruth and how she wrote one letter to every youth group graduate. And as I was sharing the story, a man raised his hand in the audience, and it kind of interrupted me. And so I called on him, and and I said, yes. And he said, well, I actually was here last night, and I saw who you were talking to. I know Ruth. She's part of our church. And she doesn't write those students just one letter at the start of every fall. She writes those students every week. Every student, every week. Now, I don't know how large Ruth's church is, but I love that Ruth is giving those young people that sense of belonging, and her letters are laced with thoughts about their identity in Christ and how God has a great purpose for them. So every young person needs a Ruth. And folks, here's the good news. You can be Ruth to a young person, your own grandkids, or as one grandmother wrote me today, she was reading one of our books and she said, I'm convicted about who I can reach out to outside of my family. I love what one grandfather said to me. He said, I pray all the time that God would bring mentors into my grandkids' lives because they live on the other side of the country. And he said, maybe I'm an answer to prayer for somebody else who's praying for that same gift of mentoring for their grandkids. So you can have better answers, better connections, and then getting even more practical in our last few minutes that I'm going to share with you. Better conversations. Better conversations. Here's some of the most depressing news research I heard about young people during the pandemic. I'm going to start with the bad news and then get to the good news. According to Springtide Research Institute, they did a sample of 13 to 25-year-olds a year into the pandemic here in the US, and only 10% of young people heard from a religious leader during the pandemic. Only 10% heard from an influential person in a faith community during the pandemic. And friends, that's not just Christian context. That's Islamic, Jewish, Mormon, any kind of faith perspective. Only 10%. I don't know if I'm more sad or mad about that data when I think about all the churches that are not connecting well with young people. Now, Springtide Research Institute, they parsed out just Christian kids. And the numbers are a little bit better, but it's only 12%. So it goes from 10% to 12% for kids who come from Christian contexts. But here's the good news. Here's the really good news, is that 70% of young people say that after this pandemic, after the social isolation, after what they've navigated, they won't take relationships for granted now. So folks, I think there is a divine window right now for us to go even deeper with our grandkids, even deeper with the young people in our churches, because they're open to better conversations with us. And so how can we do that? Well, let me give you two great prompts. And if you're taking notes, please make sure you write these down. I'm curious. I'm curious. This is a great way to start a sentence with a young person. I'm curious. What are your favorite TV shows right now? Or what are your favorite shows that you're watching? I'm curious. What music are you listening to? I'm curious. What are you learning about God? I'm curious. What are you praying about these days? It's a great way to introduce a question to a young person, is to start with, I'm curious. And then when that young person gives you an answer, well, you'd like to go deeper, right? And sometimes it's hard to know how to go deeper. That's where I would say this 3-word phrase is great. Tell me more. Oh, well, tell me more about what you're wrestling with. Tell me more about what's hard or stressful for you at school. Well, tell me a little bit more about what's happening with your friendships. Tell me more. In fact, a really great parent that I know, he actually made a sign and put this in his living room. Tell me more, because he wanted that to be the motto of his family. So as we think about what young people are wrestling with, identity, belonging, and purpose, here are a couple good conversation prompts. Here's another one. And by the way, this is a great question to start asking our kids and our grandkids in second, third grade. If you could ask God any question, what would it be? If you could ask God any question, what would it be? And then tease out what they say. Think about how it connects with what they're wrestling with when it comes to identity, belonging, and purpose. This is a great question to ask of our grandkids. Here's another way that these questions can help us go deeper in conversation with our grandkids. It's 3 words, 3 questions, 3 words. Now, God, and how. First off, let's really empathize with this anxious, adaptive, and diverse generation. Can we really listen and ask questions? Say, tell me more, to understand what's happening now. Then, how do we think with them? I wonder what God is inviting you to in the midst of this. How is God trying to show you new things about yourself or where you belong or the purpose God has for you? You don't have to use the words identity, belonging, and purpose. They're a little technical sounding, but you can use synonyms for them or phrases. How is God trying to show you new things? And then how do you actually live out what God's trying to show you? What's one way? What's one thing that we could do this week that would maybe help you more experience that sense of belonging? That sense of identity God has for you, that sense of purpose. Lastly, I just heard today from a grandparent. I love grandparents' practical ideas. I just heard today from a new grandparent who was planning on implementing, she just had her first grandchild. She's planning on implementing something that her dad did with her kids. They lived far apart, so the visits weren't as frequent as they wanted. But anytime they got together, the grandfather went out one at a time with each of the grandkids in what he called Gab with Gramps. This was his name, Gab with Gramps. And he would create a list of questions. And at the start of every lunch, and you let the grandkid pick where they went to lunch, whether it was McDonald's or someplace more fancy, and the questions were developmentally appropriate. And at the start of each lunch, with, again, one at a time with each grandkid, he'd give the grandkid a copy of the questions. And then they would together talk through those questions. And as I thought about that, I thought, oh, I love that practice of being so intentional and having really good discussions with your grandkids and letting them know you've thought about it so much that you've got questions for them ahead of time. And then imagine if we could tease at these themes of identity. What is God showing you about yourself? What are you struggling with when it comes to your friends? Talking about belonging. What do you think, or what are you passionate about, and how might God use that in the future when it comes to purpose? These are threads that, whether we hand our grandkids lists of questions or whether it's more organic as we're in the car or around the Christmas table or whatever it might be, these questions of identity, belonging, and purpose can help us go deeper in our conversations and our connections with our grandkids. So Barb, I think that's most of what I wanted to share, and I want to make sure that we get to hear from folks, hear their questions, as well as other thoughts that have come up.
Kara, let's bring you back up. If you can open your audio and video, we've got some questions here for you. So we'll begin. So Julie makes a comment. She said, although the research in this book pertains to teenagers, it seems like it would also be helpful information for grandparents and parents of preteens.
Yeah, absolutely right, Julia. That's a great insight that, we studied 13 to 18-year-olds, but young people are certainly growing up quickly these days. And so there are 10, 11, 12-year-olds who you can really see their own quest for identity, belonging, and purpose. So it's always a good thing to keep in our minds as our grandkids are getting older. Thanks for asking that.
Okay, well, that's here comes up another one. Thank you for that. So, Phil and Sylvia, what suggestions might you have to gab with grandpa and with grandkids that are across the country or maybe in another country?
Yeah, this is where technology is our friend. And, you all as grandparents, you have ways to communicate with your grandkids that no other generation of grandparents has, including if they live in a different time zone or in a different continent or country. And so, you can do the very same thing that this grandfather did by emailing or texting questions ahead of time. And buying that grandkid their favorite lunch. Either you do it through Uber or you ask their parent, your child or child-in-law, to get them their favorite meal, and they sit there and they have the same conversation with you. So this is
Yeah,
the
what a
great
great idea.
yeah, this is the
Yeah.
great thing about technology. I mean, grandparents are doing book clubs by using technology. They're praying together. They're studying scripture together. They're playing games. They're doing all sorts of things with their grandkids. Let me just say that you who do have younger grandkids, it's never too early to start connecting with your grandkids via technology, because that way it's just normal for them, that's part of how they connect with you. And I know you love seeing your grandbabies on camera anyway. So it's a
Yeah.
win-win for everybody.
Great, and some great new ideas there. That's really awesome. All right, James asks, based on your research, what are the issues that this younger generation feels most difficult to discuss? Maybe especially difficult to discuss with a grandparent.
Yeah, that's a great and very real question. And your grandkids are going to have no problem talking to you about some topics, but there will be others that would feel a little challenging, maybe, for them to talk about with you, perhaps related to dating or struggles they might be having, etc. And so, I'll say one of my favorite games to play with my kids has been the "Who would you talk to about" game. And again, you can start this in 10, when your grandkid is 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, etc. Who would you talk to if you were struggling with cheating? Who would you talk to if you liked somebody? Who would you talk to if you had a really tough question about God? And, part of what you're doing is you're helping that grandkid think about who are the other adults that they can go to. Maybe if there are topics that are tough for them to talk with you about, who is there in their church? Who is there in their neighborhood, other family members that they could talk to. So the "who would you talk to about"
Right.
game, great game.
Yeah, great ideas and information. So, how do you help grandkids who don't know Jesus and with those three things: identity, belonging, and fitting in?
Yeah, absolutely. Shirley, I'm glad you asked that question. We hear it all the time from grandparents whose own kids have perhaps drifted from the faith. And so, they have this deep burden for their grandkids to know Jesus in a personal and deep way, and aren't really sure how to do that. Well, this is where, and I think this was said in the interview beforehand, like, how do we share our own story about how God has changed us? And so, you need to be sensitive to what your kids feel comfortable with, your grandkids' parents. But for you to talk about how God is showing you new things about your identity, how you're learning more about your purpose. And so I think the more that we can share personally, the more that those narratives come alive for our grandkids. So
Yeah.
I would start there.